In a great medieval kingdom, where the palace walls touched the clouds, and the king's word was law, there lived a boy who had nothing, and belonged to no one. He had no mother, and no father, and no name that anyone had bothered to remember, and he slept wherever the night found him. Every morning, he woke before the rest of the city, and walked through the market streets looking for anything that would get him through another day. He had learned early that the world did not offer anything to those who waited, so he moved quickly and quietly, and kept his sharp eyes open at all times. On one cold gray morning his stomach had been empty for 2 days, and the smell of fresh bread from the market stalls was more than he could bear. He reached out and took a single small piece of bread from the edge of a stall, and before his fingers had even closed around it, a heavy hand grabbed him from behind. The head guard was a broad, frightening man who had spent years making examples of those who broke the king's law, and he had no patience for thieves, no matter how small. The boy did not struggle, and he did not cry, and he did not beg, which was the first thing that made the guard look at him differently. He was dragged through the market streets, and through the palace gates, and down the long stone corridors, until the great throne room doors swung open before him. And there, at the far end of the room, sitting on a throne that seemed to touch the ceiling, sat the most powerful man in the kingdom, looking down at him. The boy had never seen the king before, but he did not look away, and he did not lower his head, and something about that stillness made the entire room go quiet. The head guard announced the crime and pointed at the boy, and waited for the king to deliver his judgment, as he always did, quickly and without question. But the king did not speak immediately. He simply looked at the boy for a long moment with eyes that were sharper than anyone in the room expected. Then he leaned forward and asked the boy directly why he had stolen the bread, and the boy answered without hesitation and without shame. He said, "I was hungry, and I had nothing, and I took the smallest piece I could find, and I would do it again, because a body cannot think or speak or stand straight when it is not eaten." The throne room was completely silent after those words, and even the head guard did not know what to say. The king sat back slowly in his throne, and something moved behind his eyes, something old and private that no one else in the room could see or understand. He raised his hand and silenced the head guard, who had begun to speak, and then he looked at the boy again for a long time, without saying anything at all. Then he stood up from his throne and stepped down from the platform and walked across the throne room floor until he was standing directly in front of the boy. And the boy looked up at him, and the king looked down, and for reasons that no one in that room could yet explain, neither of them looked away. The king crouched down before the boy and looked at his face from close up, and what he saw there stopped something deep inside him that had not stopped in a very long time. He asked the boy where he had come from, and the boy said from nowhere in particular. And the king asked who his parents were, and the boy said he had never known them. The king asked the boy his name, and the boy said he had never been given one. And the king was quiet for a moment, and then he asked the boy what he called himself. And the boy looked at the king and said, "I call myself alive, because every morning I wake up as a morning I did not give up, and that has always been enough." Something shifted in the king's face when he heard those words, something that the advisors and guards watching from the sides had never seen move in the king's expression before. He stood up and walked to the throne room window and looked out over his kingdom for a long time with his hands clasped behind his back, and said nothing. Then he turned and walked quickly to a large wooden chest in the corner of the room and opened it and began searching through old documents with urgent hands. The boy watched from across the room as the king pulled out an old yellow document and unrolled it slowly and held it up to the torchlight. The king's eyes moved across the document and then stopped, and he stood very still for a moment, and then turned and looked at the boy with an expression that changed everything. He walked back across the room and placed the document on the table before the boy and pointed to a single line and said, "Read this." The boy leaned forward and read the words slowly and carefully, and as he read, his hands began to grip the edge of the table tighter and tighter. The document was a royal birth record dated 11 years ago, and the name written at the top was not a common name, and the seal at the bottom was not a common seal. The boy looked up from the document and stared at the king, and the king looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then the boy asked, in a voice that was quieter than any voice he had used before, if this document was real, and the king said, "Yes, it is real, and it has been real since the day you were born." The boy sat back in his chair and looked at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time, and the king watched him do it and said nothing, because some moments require silence. Then the king walked to the throne room door and called for his royal advisers. And when they entered and saw the boy sitting at the royal table, their faces went through every possible expression at once. The king placed the document before his advisers and pointed to the seal and the names and told them what he had discovered, and the room became so quiet that the torches could be heard flickering on the walls. The head guard who had dragged the boy through the market streets stood in the doorway with his mouth open, and all the authority drained out of his face like water from a broken vessel. The king walked back to the boy and stood beside him and placed one hand on his shoulder and spoke to the advisers in a voice that carried the full weight of the crown on his head. He said, "This boy came into my throne room today accused of stealing a piece of bread, and what I discovered is that everything that was ever stolen was stolen from him." The royal advisers looked at one another and then back at the king, and not a single one of them had the courage to say a word against what they had just heard. The king reached down and removed the royal signet ring from his own finger and held it in his palm for a moment, looking at it before turning to the boy. He placed the ring carefully onto the boy's finger, and it was slightly too large, but it sat there with a weight and a meaning that filled the entire room. The boy looked at the ring on his finger, and then looked up at the king, and for the first time since he had entered the palace, his sharp, intelligent eyes filled with something he had never allowed himself to feel before. The king told him that from this day forward he would want for nothing, and that every door in this palace was open to him, and that no hand would ever be raised against him again. The boy sat quietly for a long moment, and then he asked the king one question, and it was not the question anyone in the room expected him to ask. He did not ask about the throne, and he did not ask about wealth, and he did not ask about the name he had never been given. He asked the king why he had never come looking, and the room went so silent that it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The king stood very still and looked at the boy, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower and quieter than anyone had ever heard it before. He said, "I did not know you existed until today, and that is a failure I will carry for the rest of my life, and no crown and no throne can ever make it right." The boy looked at the king for a long time after those words, and then he nodded slowly the way someone nods when they have decided to put something very heavy down. He said, "I did not survive all these years by holding on to things that would have crushed me, and I do not intend to start now." The king looked at the boy, and in that moment every adviser and guard in the room understood that the child standing before them was not ordinary in any way. The king ordered the palace servants to prepare a proper chamber for the boy, and to bring him everything he needed, and to treat him with the same respect they would show the king himself. The boy was led through the grand palace corridors, and he walked through them the same way he had walked through the market streets, quietly and observantly, and with his head held straight. That evening the king sat alone in his throne room for a long time, looking at the empty chair across from him where the boy had sat, and thinking about all the years that could not be given back. The next morning the boy appeared at the throne room door early before anyone else had arrived, and asked the king if he could sit with him, and the king said yes without hesitation. And so they began, and what started as two strangers sitting in an enormous room slowly became something that neither of them had words for, but both of them needed. The boy learned the kingdom, and the kingdom learned the boy, and in the halls where power had always moved in straight hard lines, something began to move differently. And the piece of bread that a hungry orphan had reached for one cold gray morning turned out to be the thread that, when pulled, unraveled everything and rewove it into something neither a king nor a boy could have ever found alone.